The locksmith's key didn't fit. I stood on my own front porch, 14 days after major surgery, trying 3 times to turn a key that had opened that door every single day for 28 years, and it simply wouldn't turn. Taped to the door at eye level was a printed note. Not handwritten. Printed like a form letter, like something you'd get from a dentist's office. It read, "Your room is ready at Green Valley Care Center." I read it twice, certain it had to be a mistake, some piece of junk mail meant for a neighbor. And then the front door opened from the inside. My husband stepped out onto the porch. Behind him, in the doorway of the house I had lived in for almost 3 decades, stood a woman I had never seen before in my life, 30 years old at most, holding a mug of coffee like she already belonged in my kitchen. My husband looked at me the way you look at a problem you've already solved in your own head. "You need professional care now," he said. Calm. Rehearsed. Like he'd practiced saying it in a mirror. "My name is Sarah. I'm 52 years old, reddish brown hair I've never bothered to color, blue eyes, and until that afternoon on my own porch, a woman most people would have described as almost impossibly calm. I have been calm my entire married life. It turns out calm is exactly what lets a person get away with something like this for 2 full weeks without you ever suspecting a thing. 14 days earlier, I'd gone in for a routine but serious surgery, nothing life-threatening, but enough to keep me in the hospital recovering, sedated on and off, disoriented, grateful every single day that my husband of 28 years was, according to the nurses, so attentive. Always the first visitor, always asking detailed questions about my prognosis, my medication schedule, how many more weeks I'd likely need before I was back on my feet. I thought he was worried about me. He was calculating a timeline. While I lay in that hospital bed, unable to so much as check my own mail, my husband changed every lock in our house. He hired movers to pack up my clothes, my books, my late mother's jewelry box, and put all of it into storage. He signed an intake agreement with a private memory care facility 40 minutes outside the city, using a diagnosis no doctor had ever given me. And he called my sister, my cousins, my 2 closest friends, and told each of them, in a voice thick with performed grief, that I was declining fast. That the surgery had triggered something, that he'd been watching the signs for months and simply hadn't wanted to worry anyone. Standing on that porch, looking at the woman holding coffee in my kitchen, I understood something with total icy clarity. He hadn't panicked. He hadn't made an impulsive decision in a moment of stress. He had planned this. Every part of it. He'd been planning it, I would later learn, for months. "Where are my things?" I asked. My voice came out steadier than I expected. "Sarah, please don't make a scene," he said, glancing past me like he was worried a neighbor might be watching. "This is for your own good. You haven't been yourself. I just had gallbladder surgery, Richard. I haven't lost my mind." The woman in the doorway shifted her weight, uncomfortable, and for one brief second I almost felt sorry for her. She had no idea, I would later realize, that she was standing in a house that had never once, not for a single day in 28 years, actually belonged to the man she was sleeping with. I didn't argue on that porch. I didn't cry, though every part of me wanted to. I turned around, got back into the car I'd taken from the hospital, and drove not to a hotel, not to my sister's house, but to the office of a woman named Patricia Kwan, the attorney who had handled every legal document my family's company had ever produced for the last quarter century. I sat across from her desk, still in the loose recovery clothes I'd worn out of the hospital, and told her everything. She listened without interrupting, the way good lawyers do, taking notes, her expression giving away absolutely nothing. When I finished, she set down her pen. "Sarah," she said, "I think it's time we walked through exactly what's in your name." I would learn later from my sister exactly how convincing he had been. He'd called her from our kitchen, voice cracking at exactly the right moments, describing episodes of confusion I'd supposedly had, dates I'd apparently forgotten, a version of me that existed nowhere except in his own carefully constructed story. My sister had cried on the phone with him. She'd even offered to help pay for a better facility, not knowing there was nothing wrong with me at all. When I finally called her myself, 3 days after the porch, her voice was full of a confusion that slowly, sentence by sentence, turned into horror as she realized what she'd actually been told, and by whom, and why. He sounded so sure. She kept saying, "Sarah." He sounded so sure. That's what frightened me most, honestly. Not that he'd lied. People lie. What frightened me was how easily, how smoothly, how completely he'd rehearsed a version of reality good enough to make my own sister doubt me before I'd even had the chance to speak for myself. Here is the thing my husband never understood, in 28 years of marriage. When we started the company together in our 20s, it was my father's small accounting practice, willed to me, and me alone, when he passed. I built it into something bigger with Richard beside me. Yes, his ideas, his charm with clients, his handshake at every ribbon cutting, but the legal structure underneath all of it, every share, every filing, every asset acquired in the decades since, had been registered under my name. My father's old lawyer had insisted on it before he died, some instinct he never fully explained, and I'd simply never seen a reason to change it. Richard, for his part, never asked. He signed whatever I put in front of him at tax season without reading past the signature line. He called himself the founder at every dinner party, every industry conference, every interview with the local business journal, and I let him, because it never once occurred to me that the story he was telling other people was slowly becoming the story he believed about himself. The house we lived in, the one he'd just had my belongings hauled out of, deeded solely to me, purchased with proceeds from the company before we married. The investment accounts. The commercial property the company operated out of. All of it, every asset that mattered, had my name on it and my name alone. Richard didn't know that. Not really. Not in a way that had ever registered as a fact he needed to worry about. He believed, the way people believe things they've simply never had reason to question, that a 28-year marriage meant everything was quietly, automatically, half his. Patricia leaned forward. "There's something else you need to know," she said. "While you were in the hospital, your husband contacted a business broker. He tried to initiate the sale of the company." I felt the room tilt slightly. "He tried to sell it? Without me?" "He tried," Patricia said. "The broker's office called our firm 2 days ago for a document verification. Standard procedure before any sale conversation goes further. That's actually how I found out something was wrong before you even walked in here today. The broker couldn't proceed. Because legally, Richard isn't an owner of the company at all. He's not on a single filing. Not one. He couldn't sell what was never his to sell." I sat there in silence for a long moment, absorbing what that meant. He hadn't just tried to have me quietly disappeared into a care facility on a fabricated diagnosis. He had, at the exact same time, tried to sell our life's work out from under both of us, to fund whatever future he'd already been imagining with a woman 30 years old, standing in my kitchen with a mug of my coffee. "What do you want to do?" Patricia asked. I thought about the version of me who might have wanted to make him suffer for this publicly, dramatically, the way I imagine some part of everyone wants to when they discover a betrayal this complete. But sitting in that office, still sore from surgery, still absorbing the fact that my husband had told my own sister I was losing my mind, I realized what I actually wanted was simpler than revenge. I wanted my life back. Cleanly. Legally. Without ever having to raise my voice. I want to move quickly, I told her. And I want it done exactly by the book. It took a week. Patricia filed the paperwork to formally establish, on record, everything that had already legally been true for 25 years. She sent notice to the memory care facility, along with a signed letter from my actual physician confirming I had no cognitive impairment of any kind, which ended that arrangement within a single phone call. She contacted every relative Richard had called with his fabricated story, and let the truth calm, documented, and remarkable truth do the rest of the work for her. And then, 7 days after I stood on my own porch holding a locksmith key that didn't fit, it was Richard who stood on that porch with a suitcase, because the house, like everything else, had never been his to keep me out of. I wasn't even the one who told him to go. Patricia handled it, through a formal notice, calm and procedural, the kind of document that carries more weight in its quiet, precise language than any shouting match ever could. I watched from the upstairs window as he loaded that single suitcase into his car, not the collection of boxes he'd had movers use to empty out my things 2 weeks earlier, just one bag, hastily packed, because there had never really been time to plan for the possibility that any of this could go the other way. He stood in the driveway for a long moment before getting in the car, looking back up at the house, and for one strange second I thought he might come to the door and actually try to explain himself. He didn't. He just got in the car and drove away, and I realized watching him go, that I felt nothing close to triumph. Mostly, I just felt tired, the particular tiredness that comes after carrying something heavy for far longer than you realized you were carrying it. The woman from the kitchen, I never did learn much about her, and honestly, I never wanted to was gone by that same afternoon. I don't know if she left because she found out the truth about the house, the company, the 28 years of assets that were never going to be hers either. I don't know if she left because watching a man get formally, legally removed from a life he'd spent months trying to steal was simply not the future she'd signed up for. Either way, she was gone before Richard's suitcase even made it to the car. I didn't go after him for more than what was already factually mine. Patricia offered more than once to pursue everything he was legally entitled to under the circumstances of what he'd attempted. The fraudulent care facility placement alone, she said, could have supported serious legal consequences. I declined. Not out of forgiveness. I want to be honest about that. I declined because I understood, somewhere in that first week, that spending the next several years of my life fighting him in a courtroom would simply be handing him more of my time than he'd already stolen. So instead, I did something quieter. I sold the company not out of defeat, but because building it in the first place had never really been my dream. It had been my father's, and then it had been the story Richard told at dinner parties, and somewhere along the way I'd simply forgotten to ask myself what I actually wanted. The sale closed within 4 months, at a price Patricia called extremely fair, and honestly, a little generous. To a management group who kept every employee on staff, which mattered to me more than the final number on the contract. I used part of the proceeds to buy a small house by a lake 3 hours outside the city. Nothing grand, just a porch, a dock, more quiet than I'd known in 28 years of running a business and a marriage at the exact same time. I sat on that dock most evenings that first summer, and for the first time in longer than I could remember, I wasn't managing anyone's expectations but my own. Some nights I'd catch myself waiting for a phone to ring, a car in the driveway, some old reflex from 28 years of being the one who kept everything running. It took months before that reflex finally went quiet. When it did, the silence didn't feel empty. It felt, for the first time in a very long while, like mine. With the rest, I started a small foundation. We call it simply the Second Porch Fund, named, half-jokingly, after the porch where I first understood exactly what my husband thought he could get away with. It provides emergency legal consultations, temporary housing, and financial literacy support to women over 50 who find themselves facing exactly what I nearly faced. A partner who has quietly assumed control, or ownership, or authority over a life that was never actually theirs to control in the first place. We've helped so far a little over 200 women. Some of their stories are far worse than mine ever was. Some involve locked bank accounts, forged signatures, husbands who convinced adult children their own mothers were unstable, simply to move faster on assets no one had bothered to check the paperwork on. I read those case files some evenings, And I think about how close I came to actually believing, for even a moment, that maybe I really had lost my footing after that surgery. That maybe he was right. That's the most dangerous part of it. I've come to understand not the betrayal itself, but the small, quiet window of doubt a person tries to open in you first, so the betrayal has somewhere to land. I don't think about Richard often anymore. I heard, secondhand, through a mutual acquaintance, that he's renting an apartment to towns over, working sales for someone else's company now, telling people, I imagine, some updated version of the story he always liked to tell about himself. I hope, honestly, that he's found some kind of peace. I mean that. Bitterness, I've learned, is its own kind of unpaid rent, and I've stopped paying it. What I want people to understand, if they hear this story and see even a shadow of their own life in it, is this: trust is not the same thing as ownership. Loving someone for 28 years does not mean handing them the deed to your entire life, your name, your judgment, your sense of what's real. I trusted my husband completely, and that trust very nearly cost me my home, my company, and my own sense of my mind, in the space of 2 weeks while I was too sedated to even notice it happening. Never let another person write the story of your own life simply because you loved them enough to believe they wouldn't. Read the paperwork. Know your own name on your own documents. And if you ever find yourself standing on a porch, locked out of a life you built with your own two hands, remember that calm is not the same thing as powerless. It took me exactly 1 week, one lawyer, and 25 years of paperwork I never thought I'd need to get every single thing that was always legally mine.